Welcome everybody to AE911Truth Webinars. This is Richard Gage, AIA. I'm a member of the American Institute of Architects and founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. 2,700 technical and building professionals calling for a new investigation of the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. I am very excited today to present to you in our series here of four presentations, the week 2, where we go in depth into the destruction of Building 7 and the official report that came out by NIST, FEMA, American Society of Civil Engineers. We'll look at their NIST's computer simulation, a deeper analysis of these fires, and look at some of the structural engineers that have spoken out. Last week we had our introduction. So every month we have 4 full weeks of webinars, and we're excited to present today, week 2. In next week, Thursdays, we're 1 p.m. Pacific, we'll be looking at week 3 and 4. 3 next week, 4 the week after that, where we go into the Twin Towers. So a little bit about me. I've been an architect for 28 years. I've worked on many different types of buildings, including these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums in the San Francisco Bay Area with the construction documents and the construction administration for this $125 million high school in the Bay Area. And also more recently, the construction documents and administration for this $400 million project in Las Vegas, Nevada, near Las Vegas. This is a project with mid-rise office space, commercial space, altogether more than 1,200 tons of fireproofed steel framing. I'm joined in this effort by 2,700 architects and engineers who have put their reputations on the line, having looked at the evidence, which you're going to be seeing today, having come to the conclusion that we've not been told the whole story, and what we have been told is not the truth. And that's why we have thousands of highly qualified technical and building professionals demanding a new investigation. And I'm honored to be counted among them. We founded this organization 10 years ago. We've been educating architects and engineers all over the country, the public, the media, the building elected officials as well in Washington, D.C., where we've given our DVD and our petition personally, not personally, but to their office in Washington, D.C., 535 congressional elected officials. We've met with their staffers. They've had the opportunity to have a glimpse, several dozen of them, where we showed them the evidence you're going to be seeing today in a 15-minute presentation, which we have called Solving the Mystery of World Trade Center 7, narrated by Ed Asner. We've also been throughout the United States in the last year showing our film, Firefighters, Architects, Engineers Expose 9/11 Myths. And we have been to state and national conventions of the American Institute of Architects, where we've had a booth by the gracious donations of our supporters around the country to present the evidence of World Trade Center 7 to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of architects specifically, and then engineers at an engineering conference, where we use the scientific method to answer questions. How does that work? We've had it for 100 years or so in this country. I mean, in the West, at least. We formulate a question. How did these towers come down? In today's case, building 7. Well, we do some research, and we make some observations, and we construct a hypothesis. That's our best guess. How have other towers come down? What's likely to have brought this tower down? What was going on? Is it airplanes? Is it fire? Or is it explosions? We lay out all the hypotheses objectively. We don't pre-select those whom we're predisposed to. This is an objective process where we winnow error from truth, fact from fiction. And we make predictions. Well, if that hypothesis would be true, what else would be true? So we can test those predictions with experiments and arrive at conclusions which are supported by the experiments. We analyze the results, and if the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner, so all can build on the body of the work that we're doing. We don't hide our work. It's open and transparent. We're deeply chagrined, for instance, that NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked by Congress to provide an explanation to the American people of how all 3 of these World Trade Center skyscrapers collapsed. And what did they do? They kept their input data for their computer model, which was designed to prove their theory that this building came down due to normal office fires. So we sent a FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act. Governments can't keep secrets legally. And so we've been allowed in this country, well, we've secured rights, which we have, and with the Freedom of Information Act, we said, we want to see the computer input data for Building 7. And they said, no, can't give it to you. It might jeopardize public safety. Well, how could it jeopardize public safety to withhold this vital information from the architects and engineers who are tasked with ensuring the public safety? So we have greater efforts to secure this information. In fact, as you'll see, we've secured our own computer dynamic analysis through the University of Alaska's one of the best top forensic structural engineers in the country, Leroy Halsey. I'm going to tell you about that program, to do a 2-year, $300,000 study. And we're going after the truth, and they expect to find it, and we're expecting that to be a major player in the awakening of professionals across the country. But we're going to use the scientific method right now. We're not going to wait till that comes out next year. We're going to gather data. What are the forces that destroyed buildings? Well, we reviewed explosions. We reviewed earthquakes last week. We're going to look at fires a little more today. Fires never brought down a high rise, ever, except on 9/11 when we've had 3. High rises are fires are an organic process. They burn through a building every 20 minutes or so in a given area, move on looking for fresh new fuel sources. So if a building, say a wood frame building, which certainly have come down, was to collapse due to fire, we'd expect a gradual collapse. It would fall over, not straight down through the path of intact, cold, hard structure below. But let's take a deeper look at steel frame buildings in fires.
The way in which steel-framed buildings behave in fires depends on their construction. In this test, done by British Steel in 1995, a large amount of typical office furniture was burned to see what would happen to the heavy steel beams that supported the ceiling.
When steel is bare, when it heats up, it gets weaker. It's not that it melts in a fire. In fact, the fires, normal fires, are not hot enough to melt steel. Even if you were, for example, to use an unusual fuel like kerosene, you cannot achieve temperatures hot enough to melt steel. But what happens is it starts to lose its strength. And as it loses its strength, it starts to sag. It becomes softer and sags and can no longer support the load.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
Until recently, of course, we're referring here to 9/11, where we did have 3 collapse. Now, what did you just see? You just saw a historic fire test in the United Kingdom in 1995 in Cardington, where they burned an 8-story building with 2,000-degree fires, which are unheard of, completely unheard of. Even in 9/11, we didn't have fires anywhere close to those temperatures on 9/11. And yet this building and these beams and columns, unprotected, no fireproofing on many of them. Some of them had fireproofing. They were testing both conditions. It did not fail. They merely softened a little bit and sagged, because steel can lose half of its strength at 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit. In fact, there's many examples of much hotter, larger, and longer lasting fires in skyscrapers that have never collapsed. They remodeled them, they put them back into commission. So let's take a look at the 3rd skyscraper. Many of us have not seen the collapse of this building. You know, most architects and engineers don't even know about it. How do I know that? Because I have talked to thousands of architects in the last 10 years at conferences, including the last 8 AIA conventions, annual conventions, where hundreds of them walk by, see Building 7 going down, and we ask them, did you know about the 3rd tower that came down on 9/11? And most of them will say, what? And there they see it going down in front of them. We say, well, what does this look like to you? Well, let's see what it looks like to you. I'll show you the collapse of this building in a moment. Here's Building 7. It's about half the height of the Twin Towers, 47 stories. That would be the tallest building in most of our states. It's huge. Each floor is the size of a football field. It's an acre. Each floor is an acre. It is a football field away from the Twin Towers, 100 yards or so, the North Tower. It wasn't hit by an airplane. So we're going to set aside for this week the discussion of jet fuel and plane impacts. We're looking at the destruction of a building that, according to the official story, which came out 7 years later in 2008, with a conclusion that this building came down due to normal office fires. So the Twin Towers went down earlier that day in the morning. 7 hours later, Building 7 collapses. Here it is, surviving nicely after the Twin Towers went down, or during that time. And there was some minor damage to the building. NIST claims that this is not a significant factor in this building's collapse. In fact, they focus on a structural failure on the opposite side of the building. They rule out damage from the Twin Towers. They rule out diesel fuel, which was in this building, but they say there's no evidence that it was burning. They rule out the ground shaking from vibrations from the collapse of the Twin Towers. We'll look in detail this week about what their theory is and how much sense it makes. But first, we're going to note that there are typical features of controlled demolition. And we looked at those last week in detail. And I encourage you to go back and look at the archive and pick up the basics, which we're going to not be able to cover today because we're going into more depth. Right on the website, AE911Truth.org, we have the archives of our previous webinars. So let's start with seeing if there is a sudden onset of destruction at the base of this structure. When we look for the first time, for many of you, a glance at the destruction of this building, narrated in this case by Dan Rather that morning on CBS.
And what you're seeing are high shots. Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself. Describe that. Now we go to videotape the collapse of this building. It's amazing. Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
Well, that's an interesting comment. Of course, we've never heard that comment from Dan Rather again after that morning, which was his intuition about what he was looking at. Indeed, it looks exactly like the old hotels in Las Vegas. And that's the first intuition of all the architects that come by our booth, who see it for the first time, or maybe not for the first time. They all, 90% of them, say that's a controlled demolition, or that looks like a controlled demolition. Well, we haven't seen this building destruction played on national television, with the exception of maybe 4 times in the last 10 years. Why? This is easily one of the worst structural failures in modern history. After the Twin Towers, it is the worst. Should have been the most studied building failure in history, because many high-rises are built just like this, hundreds, with long span steel beams, which we'll come back to. This should have been the most studied failure. All architects should know about this, and yet most of them don't. Why? Wasn't hit by a plane, no jet fuel. Well, let's take another look. Is there a straight down, symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint? Well, let's take a look from West Street. Pretty straight down, pretty symmetrical. Notice that the penthouse in Screenwall up top collapse a half a second prior to the overall collapse of this building. What is that telling us? That's telling us that the structure below, the columns in the core around the elevator shafts, have to be somehow compromised all at once a half a second prior to the perimeter columns, allowing the penthouse to collapse a half a second prior. Now, as you'll see, this completely violates the basic theory of NIST, which suggests that the failure is initiated in the northeast corner, as we'll see with column 79. A fascinating discrepancy overlooked by most. But I'm not quite convinced yet. Is there any comparison between a known controlled demolition on the right, a series of them, and Building 7's destruction on the left? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? Especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition, especially since fire, the official cause of this building's collapse on the left, has never brought down a high-rise ever. Wouldn't we expect that NIST would put forth a hypothesis that's reasonable and seriously examine it in their final report, which they delayed for 7 years, perhaps hoping that architects and engineers would just forget about this after so long? And yet it was relegated to a footnote, a frequently asked question on their website, in which they say, well, it couldn't have been controlled demolition because they couldn't have brought that much explosives into the building. If it was thermite, as we'll get to in a moment here, then it would take, I forget what the number is, 100 pounds of thermite, forgetting that shaped cutter charges can be used very, very efficiently with thermite, as we'll see. And they said it couldn't have been an explosion because that would have been heard blocks and blocks away. In their frequently asked questions about thermite, suggesting forgetting or ignoring the reality that thermite is much, much quieter, doesn't have the loud signature of bangs and bright flashes associated with high energy explosives, which are normally used in controlled demolitions. So there's a number of problems we have with NIST, not the least of which is the fires themselves. Is the building engulfed in fire? Well, these are the worst fires that we have photographic or video evidence of in this building. And yet NIST claims the building was fully engulfed in fire. Let's see if we can get these videos. There we go. And there are few, small, and scattered. On the 12th floor, particularly on the back side of this building from the North Tower, we have fires that do occur in the early afternoon, but they move across to the east, to the west, such that NIST claims the fires are raging about this column 79, which is underneath the east penthouse, because the east penthouse falls about 6 seconds prior to the overall collapse of this building. So this is the area of the initiation of collapse that NIST focuses on. But what's the problem? These fires are burned out over an hour before on the 12th floor, where NIST focuses its initiation of collapse with raging fires. The photos prove that the fires were out up there. They had moved across and heading in this direction to the west. So here's NIST's fire. It starts over here on the right side, gets larger, moves across to column 79 at, they're saying, 4 p.m. But again, those fires are out. We just saw that. They burned out over an hour before. And yet they claim that they're sitting there for over an hour burning around column 79. Well, there's not enough fuel to burn that long. What the photos show is that these fires moved from 79 at 2 or 3 over to the west side and leaving column 79, according to the photos, not anywhere near the heat. Why is this important? Because there's a theory that NIST puts forth. And that theory tells us that those fires expanded these long span beams, thermal expansion, which pushes this girder off of its seat on this column 79, allowing floor 13 to fall on 12, causing a pancake and collapse for 10 floors, leaving this column 79 unbraced, where it finally buckles, which is a bending process in columns, allowing the complete collapse then all the way up to the east penthouse, causing the east penthouse to fall. I'm going to point out a series of failures, impossibilities in this theory. First of all, this composite floor structure is composed of concrete and steel. And it's all fireproofed. So these steel beams could not have expanded because they're fireproofed. Here, what we're looking at here is a partial fireproofing during construction, but it all ends up being fireproofed. 2 and 3 hour protection for the columns and beams. In other words, a fire could last that long and not expand these. So this is ignored by NIST. There's a convenient theory in the Twin Towers that says that the fireproofing was actually knocked off of the structure over there by the impact of the airplane. But there's no airplane here to rely on for such an explanation. So in their computer model, NIST ignores the insulation effect of the fireproofing, and they apply the heat to the steel beams all at once in 1.5 seconds, forcing the steel beams to expand in their computer model and ripping the shear studs, which are the pins that tie the steel beams to the concrete above, making them monolithic. And that allows these steel beams in their computer model to push this girder off of its seat. Now, so far, none of that could have happened for the reasons I explained. We don't have fire the hour before this structure collapses. We have fireproofing, which would have protected it. The fire sprinklers would have protected it, but there's a convenient theory that suggests that the fire sprinklers failed. Actually, there's another report that says that the fire sprinkler was put in test mode on 9/11 for some unknown reason, causing them to fail also. Even without fire sprinklers, though, you saw in the test done in Cardington on the 8-story building, which wasn't even fireproofed, that 2,000-degree fires, which are 4 times as hot as the fires that you saw a minute ago in Building 7, they couldn't even cause the failure of these beams, of those beams in the test. They simply sagged. So it's really important that you understand the level of deception and the increasing levels that NIST is foisting upon the technical public without any peer review by the technical public, by the American Institute of Architects. All of this is put forth, rubber stamped by the American Institute of Architects without thorough investigation or peer review with its members, most of which know nothing about the collapse of this high-rise, the unprecedented collapse of a high-rise by fire. It's an unconscionable state of affairs for our profession. Those of you who are architects, particularly American Institute of Architects, need to be writing letters. So back to the theory. This beam, which is this beam, is pushed off of, excuse me, this girder is pushed off of this column, which is this column, by these beams laterally. Well, that couldn't have happened because this girder has shear studs also tying it to the concrete floor above. How do we know that? By the drawings that have been released from Frankel, who was the shop, the actual fabrication drawings from where the beams were made and shipped from the site. They call for shear studs. NIST says there were no shear studs. Well, you would not put shear studs on the beams, but not on the girders that support the beams. Every structural engineer knows this. I've talked to several of them about this. This is the most important part of the structure here for the lateral resistance, where the lateral forces from these beams are being transferred into this girder. You're not going to omit the shear studs up there in the design of this building. This is critical. Well, even if that were allowed, even if that happened and this girder was allowed to be pushed laterally, it wouldn't make it far at all. This is a 12-inch beam seat, which this girder sits on. There's not enough expansion in these long span beams to push it. The coefficient of expansion would stop it short by an inch or so. It could not fall off. Well, NIST says it didn't need to go all the way off of this seat. It went far enough to where this flange, the bottom flange of this I-beam or wide flange beam, folded because of the massive weight up above. Well, they conveniently ignore the stiffeners. They do not show them in their report or in their computer model. There are stiffeners. What do I mean? I mean these stiffeners right here, which support the flange from folding. But NIST ignores these stiffeners, which also appear right here in red, which would have kept that flange from folding. So there's just layer upon layer upon layer of deception here to try to make some theory that provides some sense to somebody who's actually reading this 1,000-page report on Building 7 that came out 7 years later. See the problem? But even if that girder could have fallen off this seat, this floor 13 could not have fallen onto 12 because there are 3 other girders securely framed into that seat on that column, keeping this floor intact. But those are effectively ignored. But even if all of those failed, this floor 13 wouldn't even have hit, much less cause a pancake and collapse of 7, because it just would have sagged down, maybe coming halfway down the column. But even if there was a collapse, a complete collapse, a pancaking collapse inside this building of 9 floors, as NIST theorized, you would have seen a massive deformation on the outside perimeter structure, because all these beams and girders frame quite securely to the perimeter structure. And you would have seen massive breaking of windows and granite panels and crumpling of this building. That didn't happen. You saw the building go down itself. These are the drawings that show shear studs, 30 of them, on this girder, which would have kept these beams from expanding and pushing this girder off of its seat on this column. I hope we've made the point by now, but if not, I'm going to help you understand another level of this deception on the part of NIST with their computer model on the right, compared in real time to the collapse of this video. Well, first of all, you see it stops after 2 seconds. They do not show us what happens during the complete 13-second destruction of this building, beginning with the east penthouse up above. But you see that they're showing it begins to crumple. It begins to tip over. It begins to do what a building would do in any kind of a natural collapse. It wouldn't collapse straight down through the greatest path of structure the columns, 40,000 tons of them below, it began to tip over like it does. So they stop it. They don't show us the rest of that. But as you can see, even if there were massive structural failure, like they're showing here from top to bottom, they actually release, even though they release 400 structural steel connections every second in order to get this building to fall as fast as the video shows the building falling, 7 seconds top to bottom, by the way. It does begin to crumple, and it looks nothing, of course, like the actual video, even though they have the control in their computer model to release those connections and to try to control the outcome of this computer model's animated collapse to try to make it look like the video. They can't even do it. And in fact, it would have caused massive damage here in the perimeter structure, breaking of granite panels and so forth. What's happening with the east penthouse? Why is it collapsing? Well, we don't see massive breaking of windows underneath, which would be exactly what we'd see if, in fact, a vertical structural failure were occurring beneath this penthouse. Something's obviously destroying that penthouse, but it appears to be limited to up here. We don't see daylight through any of these windows, and that would be indicated by a complete structural failure, allowing daylight through, as they try to show in the computer models. Okay, so we've made that point. It falls nearly into its own footprint symmetrically. The center of this building is the center of the piles in the center of the building. It's a 4 or 5 story pile. This was a moment resisting steel frame structure, and the columns are welded or bolted such that they don't bend. The relationship between the columns and the beams are designed to resist bending. And so if there was any kind of a natural collapse, you'd see a pile, which would hit other buildings. You'd see that it would fall over. You'd see remnants, recognizable, mass portions of buildings which would still be intact. You wouldn't have the complete dismembering of every structural steel beam from the next. How do we bring a building down like that? Well, in this building, we have 80 columns or so. All of them have to be removed at once. And as we saw evidenced by the collapse of this penthouse a half a second prior, all 24 core columns would have to be removed at once, allowing that penthouse to come down early, and then followed by the perimeter columns, all within a fraction of a second. And then that repeated on at least 8 floors. And I'll show you why I say that. Does fire have that level of precision? Fire, an organic process that moves through a building every 20 minutes or so, burning up in one area, moving on, looking for fresh new fuel sources. No, not going to happen. How fast is this building coming down? Well, NIST admits that it came down at free fall. Now, this was after they denied publicly for years that it came down at free fall. They say, hey, well, if it came down at free fall, that would mean there'd be no structure underneath it. Well, then they're forced by members of AE911Truth, particularly David Chandler, a physics teacher, whom we'll hear from, shamed them publicly in a press conference into acknowledging that it did, in fact, come down. This is easily observable and measurable. They said, okay, it came down by free fall, but they do not acknowledge the implications of that. Well, they did earlier. They said that means there'd be no structure. Well, how do you get no structure underneath a steel frame building with 40,000 tons of structure 5 times stronger than it needed to be to keep this building up. You have to remove that structure all at once. And that's the evidence we see in key point number 5 here, the total dismemberment of the steel structure, where it's broken up and ready for loading and shipment. It falls like a house of cards, one structural beam removed from its column on each side, all throughout the building. Buildings that fall naturally don't break up like that. They're damaged, certainly. They do not dismember. Their concrete is not pulverized to a fine powder, which we'll be looking at in the case of Building 7. Do we have minimal damage to adjacent structures? Well, here's the aerial photograph that shows us some damage to adjacent structures, but the building didn't fall over, it didn't damage them. That's part of the goal of a controlled demolition. We've looked at some of the other features in last week, like sounds of explosions heard and seen by witnesses prior to the collapse of this building. We've looked at the incredibly enormous, hot, pyroclastic-like clouds full of pulverized concrete. And we're going to look now and see, is there evidence of cutter charges? Well, FEMA did an evaluation in 2002. And its author, Jonathan Barnett, fire protection engineer, says publicly, steel members in the debris pile that appear to have been partly evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures. But there's no explanation of where these extraordinarily high temperatures could possibly have come from. These are 500-degree fires, maybe 6, maybe 700 degrees. These are not 2,000-degree fires created in that test you saw with ceiling-high piles of wood designed to create the hottest fires imaginable by hydrocarbons. No, it takes 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit to evaporate steel. And it evaporates, it melts at about 2,800 degrees. There's no temperatures or explanations of such in this fire. In fact, Abul Hasan Astani Azal, the structural engineer given unlimited access to the Fresh Kills landfill, examining, documenting the hot temperature corrosion of this steel from Building 7, completely puzzled by how this could have happened. Doesn't posit an explanation, but FEMA does. In fact, they did a complete detailed metallurgical examination of this steel from Building 7 in their 2002 report. And what do they find? Well, they find what the New York Times calls the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation. Sulfur is used. They find sulfur, the presence of sulfur, iron sulfide, molten iron mixed with sulfur. Where did that come from? Never before observed in building fires. It's called a eutectic reaction. Melting, capable of turning a solid steel girder into Swiss cheese, like this piece of World Trade Center 7 steel. The focus of their investigation, this doesn't happen in normal office fires, the official cause of this building's collapse. Rapid oxidation, sulfidation, intergranular melting. The steel is melting from the inside out. Liquid iron and hot sulfur attack on the steel. Where does liquid iron come from? This is not even melted steel. This is elemental iron that's documented here by this team of technical experts on this subject in the official report from FEMA, unexplained by NIST. And there's lots more evidence. In fact, we looked last week at the pools of molten iron found molten iron pouring out of the south tower, which we'll get to next week. Molten iron droplets found in the dust, billions of them, 10 tons altogether or so. We'll get to that in week 4. But so far we have chemical evidence by official sources, FEMA, in their 2002 report, which NIST threw out of their final report when they took over this investigation, not including any of this detailed metallurgical examination of the steel from World Trade Center 7 in their final report when it came out in 2007. It's completely removed. Well, to the 2,700 architects and engineers that I represent and most other people who see this evidence, this is direct evidence of explosive destruction. Fire can't create any one of these, let alone all of them. Fires like this one in World Trade Center 7. Now, excuse me, 5. This is building 5 on the World Trade Center complex, completely engulfed, top to bottom. If any of the World Trade Center buildings were going to collapse due to fire, wouldn't we expect it to be this one? Did it? No. Fireproofed steel frame buildings do not collapse due to any kind of fire. We have quite a history of such fires, much larger, longer lasting in these buildings, like this one in China in 2009, burning top to bottom. And in the last couple of years, there's been a number of fires in the Middle East in skyscrapers that have not brought any of those down, even though they're like this one, burning top to bottom in a complete conflagration. Well, here's before, and on the right, afterwards, slightly toasted around the edges. It's being remodeled, put back into use. But these small, scattered, relatively cool fires brought this building down in under 7 seconds, symmetrically, completely destroyed, removing one column from another beam. Now, and the data from the NIST reports, let's take a look at it. There were investigations by our government into this collapse, starting with volunteers in 2001. Well, these volunteers worked themselves into the FEMA report, finally got some funding, $600,000. And you saw the metallurgical examination that came out of that report, which was removed by NIST when they came out with their final report 7 years later, claiming normal office fires brought this building down. But look at this cast of characters, the main ones working all the way through from the FEMA report, from the volunteers. Gene Corley was involved in, was original volunteer, through all of the other reports, helping Popular Mechanics as well create their targeted effort to discredit those trying to bring truth and awareness to the American people, professionals, the media, the government about this. But they don't look at any of the evidence that we've been looking at this week and last week. They simply say, oh, they're conspiracy theorists. There's no architects and engineers. In their more recent book, when we had more than 1,500 architects and engineers signed on to a petition where we've given more than 400 presentations around the world to groups of 100 to 3,000. Now in over 90 American cities, 38 countries, they completely ignore, in fact, lie about the involvement of any architects and engineers supporting the claims of the 9/11 Truth movement that Building 7 has a serious problem. But FEMA does, in their report, suggest an implosion, which is interesting. It looks exactly like a controlled implosion. More than that, we looked last week at FEMA's suggestion that further research is necessary in order to resolve this issue, because our best hypothesis, which is fire, has only a low probability of occurrence. Fascinating. So they suggest further research, but unfortunately, we found last week that 400 truckloads were being removed from this site every day before forensic engineers could even see it. There were only 2 pieces saved from Building 7. And we saw the metallurgical examination on those 2 pieces. This is called cover-up. There's no other word for it. We're not conspiracy theorists here. But we can smell a rat. We can call for an investigation. We can show the evidence to the American people, as we're doing with you right now live. We can look at the experts. What do they say? Well, here's the Professor Emeritus of Structural Analysis, Hugo Bachmann, Chairman of the Department of Structural Dynamics and Earthquake Engineering, the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. In my opinion, the Building 7 was with great probability professionally demolished. Well, Kamal Obaid in the San Francisco Bay Area runs a structural engineering firm. And he, like 100 other structural engineers, signed on to our petition demanding a new investigation. Says a localized failure in a steel frame building like World Trade Center 7 cannot cause a catastrophic collapse like a house of cards without a simultaneous and patterned loss of several of its columns at key locations within the building. Well, that's pretty careful language that can only describe a controlled demolition. Is there foreknowledge of the destruction of this building? We looked at some last week. Let's look at some more. The department fire chief, Nick Visconti, says, hey, we're removing the command post in Building 7 over this way. That building's coming down. Now, the fire chiefs told the firefighters not to go in and fight these fires. They were told it was going to come down. They were told it had structural damage. That was the story put out. So they're all, you know, no fire, no building has ever come down due to fire. No structure, high-rise structural. Okay. Well, in fairness, you know, they did lose that morning hundreds of firefighters in a building that had structural damage. So, okay, so we're not going to argue this point. We might make the same decision to be cautious. But interestingly enough, in this interview with Indira Singh, she says, yeah, they told us Building 7 was going to come down or was being brought down. There were all these rumors about them bringing down Building 7. Some of those rumors were associated with the structural damage. Do they actually use the words? The interviewer, Bonnie Faulkner, says, and who was it was telling this? They said, well, there was the fire chief, and he said they were going to bring it down. Because I'm missing one slide here, which I'm going to catch. Missing slide. I'll show you that next month. And in fact, these construction workers walking away from Building 7, hearing an explosion behind them, looking over their shoulder back at the building, and then looking straight into the CNN camera, and they say this.
If you're in that building, it'll be coming down. All right, guys.
We are looking back. There's a building about to blow up. Hopefully, debris coming down.
What? The building is about to blow up, flame and debris coming down. So this isn't about structural damage, and it isn't about fire. Fires don't blow up buildings. What are they talking about? Well, there's plenty of other witnesses that we heard last week about explosions prior to the collapse of this building. So I encourage you to look at that information. At this point, though, is the hypothesis of controlled demolition corroborated for you with the evidence that we've seen this week? Do we have the at least eight today, of the key characteristics, and last week, characteristic features of direct evidence of explosive destruction? Can fire create any one of these? Can fire create all of them? Well, with additional corroborative testimony and data, video evidence, is this to you proof of controlled demolition? Is it proof beyond a reasonable doubt? That's the question. Do we need a new investigation? If you think so, I'm inviting you to join the 2,700 architects and engineers. Sign our petition online. It's very easy. You can do it in a moment. If you don't want to sign the petition, you can at least get our emails by signing up for our newsletter. I'll show you how to do that. You can become a member of AE911Truth. The only reason we're able to go to national AIA conventions every year is because we have 2,000 members that give us $2.50 a month, $5 a month, $10 a month. That is how we work the miracles that we are doing at AE911Truth. That is why we are seen, along with the credibility of the technical building professionals that we do have. That's why we're seen in the 9/11 Truth Movement as the tip of the spear striking at the Achilles heel of the perpetrators of 9/11. Again, we don't have conspiracy theories about who those perpetrators are. We don't speculate. It's not even appropriate for us to research that. And there's plenty of research that's being done by other credible 9/11 researchers. And you can find them on the internet, and they're doing great work. But our work is calling for a new investigation based on scientific forensic evidence, which you've seen here today. So if you agree with us that we're pointing out a problem, and by the way, the problem is much deeper than the destruction of these buildings. Obviously, if these buildings were, in this week, Building 7 was taken down by controlled demolition, then you must be aware that there are much more significant, impactful implications that require a criminal investigation, that require it to go wherever it goes. Let the chips fall where they may in a real criminal investigation by criminal investigators, investigative journalists, who largely are not doing their job. They're just feeding us the official story, the one that we just pulled apart at the seams from NIST, for instance, about the destruction of this building. So donate, support this organization, which is doing so much. Volunteer. We have so many different types of tasks that we need you to be doing with us. We call architects all across the country, for instance. We write letters to the editor. We table out in front in the public. Local action groups all across the country are being formed. We're going to have a 2-day conference in New York on 9/11 at Cooper Union. We're going to have some top national attorneys there. Daniel Sheehan, famous attorney, look him up. Judge Impassamato, the honorary Supreme Court president from Italy, is coming to speak and to listen to the evidence, some of which you've already heard. Much more will be presented during the day-long set of hearings, where a total of 8 attorneys will be hearing the evidence, making judgments, packaging the evidence for use in real legal cases that are ongoing and yet to start, and that we can take as activists to our local judge, our local governor, as evidence of some criminal activity that to many of us approaches treason. And the U.S. Criminal Code Section 18 requires us as citizens to submit evidence that we think may be treason. So we're going to provide that evidence for you and encourage you following 9/11, these hearings, to use it. So all that requires volunteers, massive amounts of volunteer work, particularly in September in New York. Join us. Demand a new investigation. Contact your elected representatives through television, radio, newspaper. Send the AE911Truth.org link to every architect and engineer you can find, everybody else that you know. If you sit on this information and do nothing with it, then you are to blame when the results of your inaction come to bear the fruit of the continued false flag operations from the perpetrators that gave us 9/11. We've got to stop it now. If 9/11 was some sort of an inside operation, what else is going on in our country that must be stopped at all costs? It's a grassroots movement growing by millions every year. You have to speak out, share the DVDs that we have, speak to new audiences, gather 6 of your skeptical friends, colleagues, and show them the 15-minute DVD by Ed Asner called Solving the Mystery of the Collapse of Building 7. Show them the DVD that I'm going to show you the trailer of in a moment. Send them the website, WTC7evaluation.org, which shows you the project we're halfway through, hiring the University of Alaska's Leroy Halsey to conduct this 2-year independent computer dynamic analysis, open, transparent, unlike the NIST computer analysis, to show exactly what could or could not have brought this building down. Help us. You can donate to that project. You can send the Beyond Misinformation 55-page booklet to every architect in your community. You can get it for free right now by clicking on the link on our website down below this screen that you're watching, if you're watching on our webpage. If not, go to AE911Truth.org, click on sign up for the newsletter, and you'll get a free Beyond Misinformation booklet. And we need you to look at this DVD, 9/11 Explosive Evidence Experts Speak Out. I'm going to show you a 2-minute trailer. You can watch the 1-hour version for free on YouTube. Just Google or YouTube search Experts Speak Out. And the 90-minute version, which has a whole lot more powerful evidence, is available on the store. Just click what you can do. You'll find our store right in that section on our website. Take a look.
I don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. There are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fire fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
more than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dit is controlled demolition.
Zeker weten.
Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we had found was a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-grade crystals are very high-temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined, and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. And the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
Imagine showing this powerful film with another hour in our free version, or another 90 minutes of solid, packed evidence, including 8 psychologists who help us understand why this information is just so difficult for so many people to digest, how it turns our worldview on its edge, upside down, like my own experience 10 years ago, hearing David Ray Griffin on the radio, not having been aware of the third tower at all before that, or that there was any alternative theory about how these buildings might have come down. I mean, I was listening to this interview, and I literally had to pull my car over, park in the gymnasium parking lot of this high school that I was working on the construction observation for, and just listen to this. I'm going, how could this be true? I mean, I would have heard about this by now. How could they even get away with this? This is impossible. And I mean, at the time, a flag-waving Republican. I was rooting for Colin Powell as he was making his indisputable case for weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And I wanted to go get those, what, in Afghanistan, who did this to us. I don't know what I am now politically. That's kind of irrelevant, but I don't trust what I see on the media anymore. I don't trust what I hear without verifying it from the mouths of our elected officials in government without verifying it myself. That's why Eric Lawyer and I, he's the founder of Firefighters for 9/11 Truth, have been on a tour with the film we made together, Firefighters, Architects, Engineers, Expose 9/11 Myths. It is a powerful indictment of the NIST report and the media mouthpiece of those who are not telling us the truth, those who won't reveal the truth, those who have betrayed our putting them in office to speak truth and to uncover what really happened on 9/11. Well, with your help and getting this video out to hundreds of your friends, as I mentioned, it's a grassroots movement. We're not getting help on the mainstream media. Yes, 3 years ago, we did get Geraldo to show Building 7 coming down. We did get him to interview one of our engineers and one of the family members calling for a new investigation. We did get him to admit that this looks like a problem to him, that these 1,350 architects that we had at the time must know something, that they may be onto something. But nothing happened after that. That was on Fox News, of all places. We did get a 45-minute interview on CNN's Washington Journal, where I spent 45 minutes going through the evidence and the problems of the NIST report, and that became their most watched video in all of their Washington Journal C-SPAN interviews. And there are thousands of them. But we haven't been called back in 2 years. So there's obviously a bite on the truth about what's going on. This week, we looked at WTC 7 in depth. Next week, we're going to be looking at the Twin Towers with an overview first, evidence of explosions. Why is there a sudden near freefall collapse once again? Why is there high velocity lateral ejections out of the South Tower, both towers, which can't be explained by a gravitational collapse? Why is there the complete shattering of the structural steel frame from top to bottom and midair pulverization of concrete? That's week 3. Today, I don't have my engineer, Andy Steele, who's normally with us and will sift through your questions normally, but he's away on an emergency. So write your questions down, send them in. We'll gather them up and take them on next week as we focus on the evidence of the Twin Towers. So thanks again for joining us, and I'm very, very grateful to be serving the 9/11 Truth movement, AE911 Truth, architects and engineers all over the country, and everybody who wants the truth to come out about 9/11. We'll see you next week, Thursday at 1 p.m. And I hope you'll join us then. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.